Okay, good morning, everybody. We take refuge in the three jewels, and as Buddhists, and the Buddhas are our teacher. The Buddhas have been our teachers, and the Dharma is a very precious medicine. But everywhere that the Dharma has thrived, we've also needed to have a Sangha as well, an aspirational Sangha, as well as a fruitional Sangha. And so it's a very good thing, a very auspicious thing, that we now have a full-fledged Bhikshuni Sangha here at Sravasti Abbey. I feel very happy about it. I'm sure you do, and we can take delight in it as something that will benefit so many beings, that the Dharma is flowing here in an embodied and living way, that we have these nurses from the Dharma nurses. And when you have become, as well as already including, a powerful Dharma lamp, then it's good to be set high on a hill like a beacon rather than under a bushel basket, so that benefit can reach to many, many beings. And so I feel very happy and honored to be here at this time with you. So, in terms of the Dharma, it's the view of Buddhism that we take refuge in reality, or in a sense, that is refuge in reality, refuge in the true nature of things, or really the seeking to understand, or the mind that knows those things. To see things as they are is what it's about for us. It's the source of suffering, is not seeing things as they are. So this is a very fundamental thing to Buddhism. It's like not just like a particular idea of a particular teacher, but it's embedded in the structure of the tradition itself. For example, as you know, the word Buddha itself, right, means someone who has awakened. And so without having to even say anything about illusion or mirages or something like that, as soon as you start with the three jewels, you've already implicitly used the metaphor of dream versus waking reality. Not to say that this is all exactly the same as a dream, but you've already said, as soon as you say Buddha, that you've implied this idea that the way we see things now is like a dream, that we're in a sense trapped in a nightmare, and that there was one who was once like us, and through accumulating certain causes and conditions over a long period of time, came to awakening, and then has the difficult task of trying to figure out how to connect with people who are still in a living nightmare. So we all suffer needlessly due to not seeing things the way they are. Is the basic not seeing things the way they are, and seeing things in a way opposed to how they are at some level, in some series of ways. And then the question, and Buddhists agree about this, and so then the question becomes, what is the problem? What's wrong with the way we see things? And the idea is that we somehow grasp at self, which seems to mean in many ways that we have an exaggerated, that is our distortion is an exaggeration of the kind of existence that things have. So it wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's not a given that just because we're in a dream that we're necessarily having a dream that things are somehow more real than they actually are. But that's the specific, it's like you can imagine alternative versions of samsara and think, well, could there possibly be a world in which people's just innate predisposition to go to the extreme of nihilism? It's very difficult to see how that would work, right? But I mean, my point is that there are these two extremes, and there's one which is the innate one, and to which we're naturally tending, and that is have this exaggerated, that distort in the exaggerating or reifying direction, the kind of nature that things have, including especially ourselves. And so then you get things like no self and emptiness as, antidotes, right, to help people understand the way things are as a kind of relief or antidote to the kind of distortion that we superimpose upon them, this extra dose of reality. So people have very many different, we say, like, exactly what do we mean by an exaggerated sense of self? What is this exaggerated sense of self or self-nature that we're grasping after? And then of course, if we look at the sutras, we find that there's a lot of different things said about this. As His Holiness has explained, you can find sutras where it says pretty clearly that the self is what carries the aggregates of the mind and body. And which doesn't quite say that the self is something real that exists apart from them, but it strongly implies that and would lead to people to think that. And then there's many other texts in which Buddha seems to be saying that the self is just a superimposition or an illusion in relationship to the aggregates. And the implication is that the aggregates are there, but we're not happy enough with that, and we exaggeratedly superimpose some real person on top of these aggregates. And then, of course, there's many sutras in which the Buddha teaches that everything that appears to us right now is like a dream and is false because it seems to be apart from us and out there and separate, a different entity, separate and cut off from our mind. And in fact, in these sutras, it's presented that the actual nature of things is that everything is always of one nature with the mind itself. And then, of course, you have sutras like the one we just chanted, in which it's laid out very explicitly that everything, every kind of category, both the categories associated with cyclic existence and the categories associated with enlightenment, any kind of thing that you can name or point at, it's all completely empty. And so you have all these different teachings of the Buddha. So it's not just like some different schools have wrong ideas based on nothing. They're looking at sutras, that provide a basis for looking at things in a certain way and reading them in a reasonable way. And I'm not going to go through all different schools of tenets, but obviously there's all different kinds of beings who have different needs and dispositions, and we can take it that the Buddha taught in different ways to help different people in different audiences at different times, and that the different schools for organizing and thinking about what these sutras meant and formulating, philosophies and systematic approaches to practice were based on those philosophies, that they were successful because they were meeting the needs of certain groups of people. But it's not the case that whatever one particular teacher or one particular tradition says is the final and highest view is necessarily the best view for each and every person to immediately adopt. That's one of the things that's good in Buddhism, is like, since there are many lifetimes, you don't have to like try to rush everybody very quickly into the proper way of seeing things before time runs out, you know. But it's like, we like try to make progress, right, and get going in the right direction. But it could be that like that wouldn't necessarily entail being able to fully adopt what, say, Je Rinpoche specifies as the highest view in this lifetime. Eventually it would. So, you know, along the lines of what I suggested before, you know, you have these different schools, and some say that, like, that the problem when we say that there's a grasping at self or an exaggerated sense of self is that there's some, we falsely think that the self exists in some substantial way, when in fact it only exists as an imputation, or a prajnapti, something that's designated or ascribed to a collection of aggregates or something that's within that collection of aggregates, and it doesn't really exist by way of its own nature, but then leaves in place the idea that these aggregates themselves might have some reality of their own. And then, you know, there's the system that emphasizes, right, that there's no external world. There are, you know, different objects that exist, but they all exist as one nature with the mind. And then there's, you know, the Madhyamaka system, which will take the view that everything exists only as a dependent designation, or only in an imputed way. Just like the other people are saying, well, there's only an imputed kind of self, and then but there's something else that's real, and that's the underlying basis upon which the self is imputed. Then in Madhyamaka you get this idea that, yeah, well, really actually everything's only imputedly existent, including nirvana and so forth. And this kind of like idea that there isn't any objective basis, anything that exists from independently of the point of view which is making some designation, is of course naturally very frightening, and it was, I'd say, you know, not just when we hear about it and try to think about wrestle with what that could mean, but I think it has been for many Buddhists for a long time. I don't know, my sense of what we've learned about the history of Buddhism in India is that, you know, the Achittamatra view, or some other kind of view that gave people the idea that they could practice a path, you know, a real Buddhist path and so forth, without having to say that absolutely nothing has any objective reality from its own side, was much more popular than this kind of idea, which became like the dominant one in Tibet. But of course all these ideas come from India, as I've been explaining so far, and His Holiness always likes to emphasize. He's like saying, you know, nothing, everything that I'm telling you is the heritage of, you know, the Nalanda masters of India, and it's nothing that the Tibetans are making up themselves, including this idea that everything depends upon, we say, a point of view from which it's being ascribed or imputed, and doesn't have anything there on the objective side of its own that can establish it. So obviously people have disagreed about how much substance to leave behind. When you're saying we have an exaggerated view of reality, just how exaggerated do you mean? You know, becomes the big question. And it's like everybody wants to have something left over that they can use to say, well, this exists, and that's why we have karma, and that's why we have rebirth, and that's why there's a difference between, that's why we have a difference between virtue and non-virtue. But what, how much, so there's a tension in Buddhist philosophy, as this is my view, is like that the history of Buddhist philosophy is a dynamic interplay between these two ideas. One, they kind of push to sort of strip away any falsification or exaggeration or reification of any sort and get down to the sort of raw, purest kind of way that things are before you superimpose any kind of reality on them. And on the other hand, the need to say, yes, but when we do that, we arrive at a view of reality that liberates dependent arising and the fact that what we do makes a difference in the world, rather than making it, canceling it out and leaving us with the sense that nothing matters. It doesn't matter what I do because I've just finished demonstrating that nothing exists anyway. We can just call anything, and if I could feel like doing this and calling it virtue, then that would be just as good as anything else because there's no objective reality anyway. So what? No problem. So there's that tension, right, between those two things. How do you preserve a way to talk about what we do makes a difference, while at the same time having an antidote that gets to the root of this reification and doesn't just like cut off the dandelions, at the top and let them like quickly grow back. Of course, the general teaching that I sort of implied a minute ago about that is that we should go with the deepest, most radical view that we can personally, individually adopt while preserving a sense of confidence in virtue and non-virtue, and that our actions, have effects and make a difference, and rather than just out of pride thinking we'll adopt the highest one and then finding ourselves in trouble. So I've tried to explain this, to my students at Central Michigan University, and one particular semester I had a large auditorium of students. And maybe I didn't make as much a connection even over the course of a whole semester with some of them. And at the end, the last day of class, I was asking students just to say, what they thought they learned. And one student spoke up rather boldly and said, well, I've learned that Buddhists are people who don't know who they are, but they're sure they used to be somebody else. And he wasn't saying it in a nice way. He felt like he had gotten what I was saying and had, was making a reductio ad absurdum, was pointing out that this is completely nonsense, and you're both going and coming, and I was like, oh, that is such an amazing thing, to come up with, because it's sort of like true, but you're looking at it from the wrong angle, right? And it was sort of like too late to try to fix the damage, it was like he's about to leave. So anyway, of course, what we would say, and I tried to say in the remaining minutes of the class, is that ultimately there is no person, and when we search to find some objectively real person that's there from its own side, there is no person, and you have to take that seriously, and you could express that as saying we don't know who we are, and then you just don't know mind, and it's a way of thinking of like letting go of this grasping onto the idea that like, yes, I know who I am, right, and it's this real person that's right here, and opposed to you, right, and so forth. And then on the other hand, that conventionally there is a person who is reborn, and that we see ourselves clearly, that is, not in a distorted way as some essentially real person that will either disappear when we die, or will have a essential soul that will go on to some other different place. But rather, seeing ourselves clearly, what we see is that Guy is just a label that is applied in relationship to a stream of experience and the material basis for that experience, and that is enough, and that idea of the two truths, in a way, is saying that that there's an ultimate. It's not exactly the two truths, but this two ways of looking at things, an ultimate way and conventional way of looking at things, open up this idea that there's different levels of analysis that you can take to things, and the fact that when you analyze things, you don't find any essentially real person. You don't find any person under analysis, right? That this doesn't absolutely destroy the person. It destroys the type of person that we were imagining to have been there. It feels like it destroys the person because we're thinking that the person and the person we imagined to have been there were exactly the same thing, of course. That's all we imagined, right? But, really what you're wiping out is the kind of person that we thought we were. This is this person that ought to be findable if it existed the way we thought it was. And that's what gets negated when you don't find anything under analysis. It doesn't actually mean there's no person there. No person of the sort that you expected ought to be there and should be there. But there could be another type of person, right? And in fact there is, and that's how it works. So His Holiness, just briefly, on page 15 of the Middle Way, he actually starts with this. He says, he quotes his own poem in praise of the 17 Nalanda masters and says, "By understanding the two truths, the nature of the ground, I will ascertain how through the four truths we enter and exit samsara and make firm the faith in the three jewels that is born of knowledge." So he starts with the two truths. That's my point here, is that he doesn't start by telling everybody, well, all you people in America need to take refuge. He starts with the two truths and explains about these kinds of things, about what it means for things to be unfindable under analysis, and what it means to apply analysis, and what emptiness means, and what emptiness doesn't mean. It doesn't mean nothingness, doesn't mean we don't exist. And he explains this in terms of saying, well, there's conventional and ultimate reality and how they relate to each other. And then as people get a firm understanding of this, then you can talk about the Four Noble Truths in terms of, this process of coming to see the ultimate nature of reality. And that being an antidote, to the second noble truth, and thereby eliminating the first noble truth and leading to the third noble truth. And it's like he's made this point, so much in the teachings when we were at Lehigh, that it's like that otherwise then you have this, otherwise Buddhism isn't distinctively Buddhist. You still can, say you're a Buddhist, but it's like, and it's fine that it's just like any other religion, but it is not distinctly Buddhist, because it's just that, okay, there's a great teacher, sure, and had some great teachings, and then there's a community of people who follow that person. Well, that's the same as every religion. And then there's a certain problem and a cause of that problem and an answer to that problem and a way to get to the answer to that problem. Well, that's the same with every religion. And the distinctive content comes in when you bring in this idea of emptiness and see how it relates to these. So that's part of what he's doing there. And part of it, of course, is that he thinks that this is a skillful way, even if maybe not traditional way, to start, because of the importance of analysis in our world for our kinds of beings at this particular time. We don't live in a world where everybody sort of takes it for granted that when we die we're going to be reborn according to our karma, and that there are great enlightened omniscient beings who have become free from this, and it's like, this is like not very far from the way most people are thinking about the universe. And so if you start, people instead are, thinking in terms of reason and analysis. And so if you start with reason and analysis and show how they lead to an understanding of something that sort of uniquely taught by the Buddha and is not found in these other traditions, then people will have an interest in, and a deeper understanding of what the other teachings are. I think that's part of what he's doing there. anyway. So of course, the Dalai Lama is there's the four main Dharma traditions of Tibet, although it's not that there were exactly or only four, but there's very much four main ones. And within that, His Holiness and this center is connected to the Gelugpa order, I guess I'm going to say Dharma tradition, Triluk. And this was founded by Tsongkhapa Sangtakpa, who was from 1357 to 1419, who was called Je Rinpoche. And he very clearly takes that whether you're doing, a sutra approach or a tantric approach or whatever kind of approach you want to take, that the final philosophical view is that of prasangika madhyamaka, among these different views of how much to relate and, eliminate and not. So a prasangika is the interpretation of madhyamaka given by Chandrakirti, who lived in India in the 7th century. And what Chandrakirti was interpreting was a Madhyamaka philosophy that had already been in place for many centuries. We'll talk later about how many, a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit unclear, but we'll say roughly 5, maybe more. So it was his particular interpretation of this tradition that comes to be regarded as the final and most profound view by Tsongkhapa. And His Holiness has said this prasangika madhyamaka view is found in all four main Dharma traditions of Tibet. So he doesn't see it as something that divides Gelugpa from other forms of Tibetan Buddhism, or at least the other main forms, or makes it better than them. It's just that they, in his view, have different ways of expressing this and different ways of practicing it, but that if you have deep understanding of the texts and yogic practice, you can come to understand how they're approaching the same view in different ways. It's worth saying in that regard that His Holiness is, he's giving a very charitable approach. We can't go into why we did more with that last year, I think. He's giving a very charitable approach because from his point of view, if they didn't have this view, they would not be final paths to awakening. But he's not just being silly about it either. His conclusions are based on very careful reasoning and analysis and experience. And he doesn't say this about every single religion or even every single type of Tibetan Buddhism. He's kind of careful in the way he says it, that the prasangika madhyamaka view is found as the final view in each of the four Dharma traditions does not mean that every Tibetan center that you go to will necessarily be teaching exactly that. So that's a little bit different. So then we come to Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is the person who Chandrakirti was commenting on when he put forth the prasangika interpretation. Nagarjuna we consider the person who initially expounded the Madhyamaka view, brought it forth into the world with the understanding that Nagarjuna was making explicit something that was already implicit in the teachings of the Buddha, and particularly in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but hadn't been spelled out in just the way that Nagarjuna did. So Nagarjuna is the first of many great writers in Indian Mahayana, and he has over 90 books, maybe almost 100 different texts that are ascribed to him on many different topics, not just emptiness. There's a lot of disagreement about which books by Nagarjuna were written by the Nagarjuna who wrote the other books. And when you start reading about this, you feel somewhat as though you'd entered a maze. I will tell you. Will the real Nagarjuna? What do you mean by the real Nagarjuna? I thought that was the whole point. And so forth. It gets very confusing. But Nagarjuna's works on emptiness, pointing at emptiness, expounding emptiness as the core philosophy in the perfectional wisdom literature, are at the center of his vast reputation. And by vast reputation, I mean, we have to note, I don't know if you know that, Nagarjuna is a tantric master. He's in the tantric lineages, and he's attributed at least 2, maybe more, commentaries on Goya Samaja Tantra, and that he's very, very significant in the Pure Land lineages. When I studied Pure Land, I was very surprised that Nagarjuna was in there, because I thought that was kind of like the opposite of Nagarjuna. But it turns out that Pure Land plays an important role in his whole life story, and also in Zen. So all over, you just pretty much, Nagarjuna becomes such a big name that you really don't want to leave him out, He's got to be, whatever you're doing, you want to get him into your lineage in some way, is one way to look at it. Maybe that's not the most pious way to look at it. But I sort of feel like that. But I mean, another way of saying this is like he was associated with very profound religious ideas that went beyond just the idea of emptiness. And so there's a huge swath of influence. And in terms of stories about his life, I think I was mentioning to Venerable Chudron that it's not just the Hindus and Buddhists who have stories about him, but also the Jains have Nagarjuna stories, and you even find them in Arabic stories, about legends about Nagarjuna doing various things. So he's one of these, he's a super famous person, you say like after the Buddha, he comes as the next, most famous person whose reputation is spread far and wide. So today I'm going to start in a little bit different way. Well, let me just sort of say what I'm going to do today is, right now, is talk about some, tell 2 versions of Nagarjuna's life story that'll be different but overlap, very different but overlap maybe in some interesting ways. And then as we go along today and this week, we'll have, or Megas, probably be even this morning, some overview of some of the important works that are associated with the name Nagarjuna, and then we'll be reading and discussing and write some selections from some of his key works. And I was thinking that in that regard, since there's a handout, and then there's this book, and then there's actually another handout which I haven't given out yet. I was thinking maybe just to say that we'll start when we finish what I'm going to be doing now. When we start looking at actual text, let's say start on page 61 of the middle way, almost at the end of the chapter on dependent origination, and then we'll go from there up, through page 91 to start with, and then we'll see where we'll go from there. So that's when we get to going over text. That's where I'm going to start. Okay, so Nagarjuna's life. This is very interesting. I mean, this was also very complicated to figure out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a composite traditional story of Nagarjuna's life that doesn't come from any single source. It comes from 4 or 5 different sutras, some tantric sources, and probably a good bit of folklore making its way in as well, in different points. A super long time ago, more than we can imagine, longer ago than you can imagine, there was a king named King Naga of Great Effort. And this, as far as I can tell, is the beginning of the Nagarjuna story. This king was married; he had a wife, and with his wife present, and also, and more importantly, in the presence of a Buddha of that time, he made vows to assist the Dharma in a future time. That's it. Okay. So that's the first step. There's this king Naga of great effort. Then, much, much later, very recently, in the time of the Buddha who lived before the Shakyamuni, named Dipankara Buddha, there was a prince, and this prince was in the same continuum as this king Naga of great effort. And Dipankara Buddha recognized that and spoke to the prince and prophesied that he would be born in the future in the presence of Shakyamuni Buddha, and that he would then later go on to become Nagarjuna. And then, in the time of Shakyamuni Buddha, Shakyamuni is present with Mahakashapa and a goddess named Vimalaprabha and a Brahmin named Kaundinya and a young man whose name in Sanskrit seems to be Sarvaloka Priyadarshana, which means something like liked when seen by all, like pleasant for everyone to see. And Shakyamuni speaks to them through Mahakashapa, as he does, as in the Heart Sutra, where he's teaching through someone else. And the goddess Vimalaprabha, who's present, is identified as being in the same continuum as the wife of the Naga king of great effort from the beginning of the story. And she is then present again for another time, but now in a different relationship, for her former husband from that very distant life to be in the presence of a Buddha. And then Mahakashapa tells Kaundinya, or Buddha through Mahakashapa tells Kaundinya that he will be in the future reborn as Ashoka Maurya, the great Buddhist emperor. And then goes on to tell the young man, Sarvaloka Priyadarshana, that in the future, when my Dharma, when Shakyamuni Buddha's Dharma declines, actually there's a question from another person in the audience who says, who will help the Dharma in the future when your Dharma declines? And Mahakashapa, Shakyamuni speaking through Mahakashapa, says there will be a great monk in the future like Mahakashapa, which is interesting to think about because it's Mahakashapa who's actually coming, the words are coming out as more. He says, like Mahakashapa, who will relieve famine and uphold the discipline of the monastic community. Now in the sutras as we have them of that particular prophecy, it doesn't say Nagarjuna, but when Chandrakirti cites the sutras, he puts Nagarjuna's name in, or else he had a version of the sutra that no one else has found that had Nagarjuna's name in it. But anyway, Nagarjuna comes to be understood whether, as being the person who was then prophesied. And that particular one, of course, is mentioned quite a lot. So let's see, that's 3 lifetimes. And then we come down to the lifetime of Nagarjuna himself. Now, as is well known, Nagarjuna lived for 600 years. I hear a few snickers. It is well known, so as predicted, I just wanted to mention that because you might think that his life goes on, has a lot of phases to it, and that's why. Okay. As predicted, 400 years after the Buddha had passed away, there was a son born to a prosperous Brahmin family in an area of southern India. And an oracle predicted that this young Brahmin child would only live for 7 days, but that his lifespan could be extended by another 7 days if gifts were given to 100 people, 100 ordinary people, and a further 7 months if gifts were made to 100 Brahmins, or a further 7 years if offerings were made to 100 monks. But the oracle didn't know any way to extend his life further. And so they just did the 100 monks, and they got their son up, 7 years. But as his 8th birthday grew close, they sent him on a pilgrimage with several of their servants because they didn't want to see him die. And the servants and the child were guided by a manifestation of Avalokiteshvara. And in this way, the party made its way to Nalanda Monastery, where they met the great teacher Saraha. And they explained the boy's plight to Saraha, and Saraha told the child that he could avoid an untimely death by staying at Nalanda and ordaining as a monk, but that he also had to do an empowerment into the long life practice of the Buddha Amitayus, or Amitabha, and he encouraged the boy to practice that extensively. So on the just before the child was going to turn 8, he stayed awake all night reciting the mantra of Amitayus without interruption, and as a result, he didn't die. And the following day, he ordained as a monk and was given a monastic name Srimanta, and he remained at Nalanda, where he was under the protection, which in part I think means the tutelage of an emanation of Manjushri named Ratnamati. And so Ratnamati taught him Sutra and Tantra, and also he was taught Guhya Samaja Tantra, in particular by his original teacher, Saraha. And so he soon became a fully accomplished scholar and teacher. He became very famous. He was eventually named the abbot of Nalanda, and some of the things that he accomplished, including cleaning up the monastery in terms of discipline at the monastery, which involved disciplining many monks and also expelling a number of monks, and debating with both various other Buddhists from other sects, but also with non-Buddhists. One source says that he debated with Shankaracharya, and which, I don't know. These are the traditional stories. And then also, and this was in fulfillment of the prophecy, I don't know if you remember, but he's predicted that he would assist the Dharma by relieving famine, in part. And so one of the things that he did was that there was a terrible famine, and the monks at Nalanda didn't have anything to eat. Saraha asked him to do something about it. And so he took 2 sandalwood leaves and, using appropriate mantras, gave each of them independently the power to transport a person wherever that person wanted to go. And he put one leaf in his hand, and he hid the other one in his sandal, went across the ocean to an island where there was a famous alchemist. And he asked the alchemist the instructions for making gold. And the alchemist was saying, well, what do you have to trade? And he said, well, I've got this magic leaf that you can fly anywhere you want. And the alchemist thought, well, if he gives me the magic leaf, then he won't be able to leave the island, so I'm not really giving up anything because he'll still be here with me. So he traded the leaf for magic secret of gold. And once he had that, he pulled the other leaf out of his sandal, flew back to Nalanda, and then they made a bunch of iron into gold, and then all the monks had food. So that was simple for him. So that's the beginning part of his life. And then from that point on, think about like the teachings of Nagarjuna, or the texts that he's associated with, are sometimes divided up into 3 phases. This early phase, when he's abbot of Nalanda, then a later phase when he comes back with the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and then a third phase at the end of his life when he'll come back with from the northern continent with sutras associated with the third turning of the wheel. So there's these 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. I don't know if you heard of this, but this idea is you break. So some people say that, well, Nagarjuna is called the second Buddha, and part of this is there's 3 proclamations of the Dharma that can be sort of made to be understood as roughly corresponding to Buddha's 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, right? And that this first phase of his life in this system is associated with his giving, teachings of advice and moral guidance. Well, of course, he's, cleaning up the monastic discipline. And so, like, for example, some people say this is the period when Sutra Samuccaya, Sutra Samuccaya is ascribed to this period. And other texts that give, like, general moral guidance, which sort of assumes that there's a person who can do virtue or non-virtue. And then in the second phase, you get, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that, and texts by Nagarjuna, like the Mula Madhyamaka, like the Treatise on the Middle Way, and so forth, which are pointing at emptiness. And in the third phase, then you have texts that he brings back, sutras associated with the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, and writes texts that are sort of in that vein. You see what I'm saying? So there's like these 3 phases of life, roughly. So the second phase, so the first phase of his life, he's writing these moral discipline-related texts on virtue and so forth. The second phase is, of course, that which he's most famous for. And according to one Tibetan source, this phase, the second phase, began less than 1 century into his lifetime. So not long after the Buddha had passed away, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which of course the Buddha had taught at Vulture Peak, the main Mahayana teachings, disappeared from this world. And it said that, some people have said it was like 40 years, I read in one person, 40 years after the Buddha passed away, then the sutras was there, and then 40 years later they went there. So some Nagas had received this teaching from the Buddha. They'd taken the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras to their own world for safekeeping, and it remained there. And meanwhile, in this place, there were only a few practitioners who could understand these teachings, and most of them were keeping their practice secret. That's the idea. So the only teachings of Buddha that people thought existed, and the only ones that were widespread, were non-Mahayana teachings, and people just assumed that was the only teachings that there were. So at some point then, during the first century of his life, he's, according to one version of the story, he's meditating by some water, and 2 Naga youth, who are in some versions also emanations of the Naga king, come and they invite him to go and teach in their land, Naga land. And he goes there and teaches them and returns with the Perfection of Wisdom scriptures, brings them back to the world, and propagates them. So he has this special connection with the Nagas. What are Nagas, right? You know, like, we keep talking about Nagas. Well, they're animals, for one, in terms of the 6 realms. We can say that with confidence. They're definitely animals, but they're very intelligent animals, and they also are magical animals, and they're very wealthy animals because they have wish-granting jewels, and they keep them. Usually, we think under the sea, like dragons. But then often they just look like snakes too, you know. So they're something in between a dragon and a snake. Apparently, they're in the dragon-snake area, and so they've been keeping the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra safe. I don't know if you saw different stories about Nagas, right? So like, I mean, they can cause themselves, they can, even though they're watery creatures by nature and their habitat, they can come onto land and appear as humans and disguise themselves as humans and, you know, try to get ordination, for example. You know that, you must know that story, right? It's like, well, you have to ask people whether they're human beings, right? To see whether they're Nagas in disguise. Is ordination suitable for humans? So, anyway, when Nagarjuna came back, so this course connection with the Nagas leads to him being known as Nagarjuna. He brings back the perfection of wisdoms. He also brings back some black Naga clay, I guess from under the sea or something, and uses it to build stupas and temples. And he teaches these perfection of wisdom sutras widely in the world. And because he also cured many Nagas of sicknesses when he was there with them with special ritual prayers. Some people think that that's why he's called the protector, because he was the protector of the Nagas. That's one. I've heard a lot of different versions of that. Arjuna was added to his name because he spread the Mahayana teachings with great speed and accuracy, just as Arjuna in Mahabharata delivers arrows from his bow. But another one that a different Tibetan teacher said that he's called Arjuna because he protected, just like Nagarjuna protected his kingdom and destroyed the enemy, that Nagarjuna was protecting the Dharma kingdom and destroying the enemy, which is the afflictions that are the basis of cyclic existence. So anyway, you get the different kinds of explanations of how he got that name. So Nagarjuna had a very lucid mind, obviously great wisdom. He was able to understand these perfection of wisdom sutras and explain them to others, doing this publicly. One day when he was doing this, Nagas came and formed an umbrella over his head to give him shade while he was teaching, and then that becomes the image that we see of Nagarjuna with the snakes over his head. He then spread these teachings widely in the world, instigating a great revival of the Mahayana doctrine. Of course, that's the idea here, is that the Mahayana is not emerging and being established, but is being revived from its previously having been taught many hundreds of years before Buddha, but then not successfully propagated. And he presented a system of reasoning based on this, which steers between the extremes of the middle way, and so it's called Madhyamaka, which means the middle way system, right? That's what Madhyamaka means, the middle way system. So the texts in this period, are called the collections of reasoning that he is most associated with, and they bring out the implicit arguments that are in the Perfections of Wisdom Sutras. That's the idea. So then, 300 years into his lifetime, he set out for the northern continent. And along the way, we're in the southern continent, right? And then he set out for the northern continent, and along the way, he saw some children playing on the road, and there was one child named Jetaka, and to this child, he spoke a prophecy that this child would someday become king of a great empire. About 200 years later, Nagarjuna comes back from the northern continent to India, and he has with him at least 4 new sutras that we associate with the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma. The Great Drum Sutra, the Lion's Roar of Queen Srimala Devi, the Tathagata Essence Sutra, and another one that has a very long name. I can tell you if you're interested. I decided not to write it down because it's so long. On return, the boy has, then he finds that the boy has become the king of the Satavahana dynasty, which is an important actual historical dynasty of southern India, but by southern I don't mean all the way down. I mean the Deccan, centered in the Deccan area of Andhra Pradesh and so forth. So these sutras that he's brought back then become commented on and become the basis for Maitreya's sublime continuum. And he forms this, well, he really has from earlier part of his life and from the boy's past life, this connection with this king. And this becomes very important in this last phase of his life. Some versions have him then writing the friendly letter and the precious garland then at this later phase of his life in connection to this king. Well, one of the things that's awkward about that is that especially the friendly letter is mostly a sort of advice that you would associate not with the third turning of the wheel, but with the first turning of the wheel, which should have gone in the first phase of his life. Anyway, so there's these little problems in making it all fit together. So it doesn't look like he's going to die. He's up into over 500 years and still going, and he has this very close relationship with his king, and he's writing a number of hymns and teaching the Great Drum Sutra, especially one of the ones that he brought back from the northern continent. So the king that he has a wife. The wife has a son. The son wants to succeed to the throne, but his mother tells him that he'll never be able to become king until Nagarjuna dies, since there's a magical connection between Nagarjuna and the king, and they will have the same lifespan. So his mother tells him to ask Nagarjuna for his head. And Nagarjuna is very compassionate, and she figures that he'll probably agree to give him the head. And so he does ask him for the head, and Nagarjuna in fact agrees. But Kumara, the prince, is unable to cut off his head with a sword because of Nagarjuna's attainment. And so Nagarjuna tells him that in a previous life he had killed an ant while cutting grass, and as a karmic result his head can be cut off only with a blade of kusha grass. And so Kumara then, with this information, is able to cut off Nagarjuna's head, and Nagarjuna dies. And the blood from the head turns into milk, and the head says, "Now I will go to the Sukhavati Pure Land." And he does, in fact, then go to the Sukhavati Pure Land, of course, that being the Pure Land of the Amitabha Buddha. He's been practicing since he was 7, right, almost 8, that practice. And but he also sends, he's going to Sukhavati, but he also sends out an emanation over to Tushita, Pure Land, because he wants to talk to Maitreya and ask some questions about the Great Drum Sutra. He's still studying. That's an important thing. It's so great, right? All right, so let's see. What about his attainment? Some sutras say that, like the Lankavatara Sutra says, and also some Shastras, Avalokiteshvara, who's the commentator on Bhava Viveka, they both say, that sutra and that Shastra authors say that Nagarjuna was a first-ground bodhisattva. Other sources say that he was a 7th ground bodhisattva. Other sutra sources say that he was a 7th ground bodhisattva who, during his lifetime, attained the 8th ground. Then these sutra sources say that very far in the future, and I'm not going to go through all the descriptions of all those very elaborate predictions about the future and all the things that will happen in it before the time of that he will become a Buddha. But in a very far future eon, there will be 8. There will be 7 Buddhas, and then there'll be an 8th Buddha, which will be the Buddha that Nagarjuna is in a continuum with Nagarjuna. And this Buddha will live for 15 intermediate aeons in a world that will have just about like optimal conditions, that lots of leisure and opportunity for everybody, and no non-Buddhist or non-Mahayana teachings. And he'll, having promulgated that Dharma for 15 intermediate eons, he will pass away, and then his teaching will last for 10 billion years after that. Instead of Shakyamuni's teaching, in the same sources, Shakyamuni's teaching will last for 5,000 years. Okay. So that's the sutra versions. But then the tantric versions say that this is just how it appears to the world. And then in fact, he was a Buddha even during his lifetime. Or maybe he wasn't born, an emanation at the beginning, but that he attained Buddhahood during his lifetime. Tsongkhapa says in Ocean of Reasoning in the beginning that if someone as great as Nagarjuna, who was practicing Guhya Samaja from the time that he was a child and who lived for 600 years, couldn't attain Buddhahood, then it's all just a lot of words. So that's J. Rinpoche's conclusion. So then we have, that's story one, came to an end. It's a long story, right? So I mean, I was just going to say a little bit about this. I mean, obviously we have we get a lot of important meaning out of these sacred stories, and some types of religious traditions and some people within each tradition, I think, put more emphasis on how important it is for each element of the story to correspond to an observable history, a scientifically locatable history. I think that probably a lot of people today understand that there can be a great deal of value from sacred stories that don't correspond to anything that's historically determinable. And I was just thinking it's like a very interesting example is the way probably most Christians in the United States have become somewhat aware that well, maybe they haven't, but I mean, it's like I'll say there's no reason to think that Jesus was really born in Bethlehem. Jesus was from Nazareth, and the whole story about Jesus, Mary going to Bethlehem and Jesus being born there, this is a pious construction that has a specific purpose in the history of Christianity, and yet, even if you know that, it doesn't stop you from finding great meaning in the story and being very moved by it, and also celebrating Christmas with the idea that, well, this is conventionally this is our practice, of doing like this, and it celebrates, the coming of love into the world, or however, the connection between the divine and the human is celebrated without people having to necessarily, even if you understand that it's not a historically observable fact that there was this baby in Bethlehem in a manger and a star over. You know what I'm saying? It sort of gets to be like everybody believes in. It is somewhat analogous to people really believe in Santa Claus even though they know it's not true, because they believe in it in a different sense than thinking that it's literally true. And I think it's just like that with the Bethlehem story, except that people haven't realized that maybe as much that it is sort of like the equivalent of Santa Claus. It's something that people, that was important to put Jesus in Bethlehem so he would be in the lineage of David, the house of David, and then which was prophesied as where the Messiah would come from, and Nazareth wasn't part of that. And so he gets moved over. And, it becomes a very powerful way of creating a world of meaning that we can live in. And so, anyway, I wanted to tell this whole story, even though, I don't know, we have different kinds of reactions to it and relationships to it, but I think we should think of, it's like here, that is the traditional story. This is comes from the sutras, it comes from the tantras, and it comes from contemporary or near contemporary Gelugpa geishas. If you ask them to tell the story, this is the way it comes out. So when you say, what do traditional Tibetan teachers think about this? They think that this is actually what happened, more or less. They might, they might not always. They'll disagree about details, but the general idea of that, Nagarjuna lived 600 years and so forth. This is the way they. And that Nagarjuna, was initiated into Tantra by Saraha at Nalanda, and this would be, I'm trying to figure out, if you map that over to, okay, so Buddha, will say, lived 2,500 years ago, and after he'd passed away for 400 years, then this boy who was to become Nagarjuna was born, and then when he was 7, he went to Nalanda. That means that Nalanda existed before the time of Jesus, which there's no evidence of Nalanda being like on the map until the 5th century, like more than 500 years after that. Nalanda is really important from the 5th century to the 12th century, but they're putting Nagarjuna here in this story like in the century before Jesus. You see what I'm saying? It's a little more than 500 years, really almost 600 years before we know that Nalanda was like a going concern. So you have to really like, it begins to, there's a lot of things that you have to put in there, you know. Okay, so Nalanda, that's the world, Nalanda as known to history, but there was a small earlier Nalanda. I mean, you know what I'm saying? You have to like do a lot of filling in to try to put together history with that story, you know. It's not just a question of do you believe somebody can live for 600 years. There's a number of other issues. So I think in this particular case, the story is inspirational and provides some guidance and gives some form or sense of it can be a, these kinds of sacred stories can be a basis for practice at this, or at the, you know, sacred stories. At the same time, they can be a narrative frame that's sort of a backdrop for practice. What I mean is that, like, sometimes people, the practice that we do is primary, but there's like a narrative in the background that sort of informs it and gives it a context. And that could be like one way of thinking about it, or another way of thinking about it is that this is, you know, this is a sacred story, and we do these actions because they replicate or bring back to life something from the story. And just playing with it in my own mind, I feel like this is much more in the case of it being something in like a backdrop to the practice, but it's nonetheless, that is what the backdrop looks like. And in this particular case, I think the very beginning of the story is important, because this idea that long ago, super long ago, the idea was that some Naga king made a vow, I will give my life to protect the Dharma during the time of, you know, the Buddha Shakyamuni, is sort of intended to convey this idea of the power of commitment over many, many lifetimes, the idea of initiative and compassionately motivated activity to carry over from one lifetime to the next lifetime and to benefit, you know, inconceivably large numbers of people. That seems to me like to be the most important thing from the story. And another thing, though, is like a couple of sub-themes is interesting, is that the idea that we have connections with certain people over many different lifetimes. Like that theme comes up a couple different times with the wife who's then later there, and then also the boy who he meets on the road. And then, you know, 200 some years later, but within Nagarjuna's same lifetime, that boy is the king. It's not really very, very, very clear, but I'm just assuming that that boy has in the interim died once or twice, because nothing is said about him not dying, so I just would think that maybe he would have. And then also, I guess the last thing, I mean, this sort of relates to the first thing, the commitment of, you know, a bodhisattva vow, in effect, you know, the commitment combined with the compassion to help others over many lifetimes, is the idea that this guy who's so famous as the teacher of emptiness is also a great bodhisattva. And this, of course, comes across in Nagarjuna's writings, that he's not just the guy, you know, who wrote about emptiness and how nothing can be found under analysis, but that this was like a teaching that's part of I was going to say a complete life, but that's not really all there is to it, right? A complete career as a bodhisattva that includes, you know, tantric practice and deep compassionate commitment to help others, of which this is like one dimension. Okay, so that's one story. I may have forgotten to mention a small point about how in that third phase, when he brought back the Great Drum Sutra and so forth, that was also when he was writing all his different hymns that he's famous for, the Chatushtava and well, it's called the four hymns, but then, as we'll talk about, it's always a question of like, which four? Because there's more than four, actually. But anyway, okay, that's one story. Now we have a shorter story. There's a lot less to this one. It's also a story about Nagarjuna. So, about 1900 years ago, there was an unknown Buddhist monk in India who wrote down the First Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. We don't know where he got it. We don't know where he got it, but that's when it appears to have been written down. And this person was probably part of a very small, widely scattered movement. And I'm pointedly using the word movement, not sect. A scattered, small movement that was strongest in the northwestern part of India and was very weak as you went south and east. And this movement was Buddhists who identified themselves, referred to themselves as bodhisattvas. And many of them were monks, but not necessarily all. Many of them lived in monasteries. It could be that some of them lived in forests and maybe were associated with the monasteries, but didn't always necessarily stay in them all the time. It's important to understand that there were, at this time, 1900 years ago, no such thing as a Mahayana monastery. It would be many centuries before there was any such thing. There was a movement of these people emphasizing the aspiration to Buddhahood, and therefore the identification of themselves as bodhisattvas with this aspiration to become Buddhas, practicing the six perfections, and cultivating compassion for all beings, and combining that with a wisdom that they directed towards something that they called emptiness. Now, they had a challenge as a small minority scattered movement to how that they would survive under the various civil laws, Vinaya laws, and also house rules that existed in each of the monastic institutions that they were staying about, like what was appropriate. So one of the biggest dangers, of course, was the possibility of being accused of creating a schism in the monastic community. And they had to avoid that. But then, as a negative, but then on the positive side, the next thing would be, to the extent possible, to get their texts, by which I mean, in the first instance, their sutras as they appeared, and then also shastras that they were writing explaining the meanings of these sutras, how to get this material to be preserved by the monastery. How could they get it incorporated into the monastic collection or monastic library so that there would be time, labor, ink, pens, and paper, appropriated is the right word, appropriated by the monastery and accepting this in some sense as word of Buddha, right? And so in other words, if they came right out and say, we're nothing like you guys have the low one, then it wasn't necessarily a good way to get that text copied and passed on to the next generation, right? So the survival of Mahayana in the early centuries seems to have involved, I guess you would say, strategies for legitimation in terms of the people who controlled the means for the reproduction of the texts that the Mahayana bodhisattvas were generating. And so maybe Nagarjuna began his career in this context. Maybe in some people we're just going to posit for the sake of telling a story, in a place called Mathura, which is south of Delhi, and that he was a prominent debater, perhaps at a Mahasangika monastery sometime in the 2nd century AD. It's possible that he was devoted to Amitabha Buddha. There is some archaeological evidence that connects Amitabha Buddha to Mathura in an early time, and it's possible that it was while he was here that he wrote his treatise on the Middle Way, which criticized various categories of Sravasti Vada or Vaibhashika Buddhists, with whom these Mahasangikas that he was, whose Sangha he was part of, were having a rivalry. So he was a Mahayanist, and he was aware of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but he based his presentation of emptiness on allusions to and intentional structures that were designed to get his home audience to see this as something that was in accord with the word of Buddha and thus suitable for reproduction. And then later in his lifetime, which was, we'll say, less than a century, he moved to the eastern Deccan, far to the south and east, and because he had obtained the patronage of a king of the Satavahana dynasty, and for that king wrote the Precious Garland. Mahayana was much, much weaker in this area than it had been in Mathura, and it hadn't been that strong in Mathura either, but at least had some presence. But it was much weaker in this far south. But Nagarjuna's connection to the king gave him a chance to argue that when there was a dispute between that involved, maybe an accusation that a Mahayanist was creating a Sangha Beda, a schism in the Sangha, that the king should not intervene, but at least should maintain some neutrality, and that the king should understand that Mahayana ideas are part of the Buddha's teachings, and that the king should perhaps go so far as to understand that critics who can't understand Mahayana ideas as the Buddha's teachings are themselves motivated by hate and anger, and thus be seen as discredited rather than fair-minded. So Nagarjuna's intelligence and his charisma enabled him to write and promulgate many texts over the course of his lifetime that had the effect of clarifying and legitimizing as word of Buddha teachings that were found in the Mahayana Sutras, but without necessarily citing these sutras. But they form sort of a bridge between between the content of these sutras and presenting the ideas that were in these sutras in a kind of format or style or context in which it would be acceptable to whatever audience he was addressing, whether that was a lay audience or, in the case of Ratnavali, or perhaps maybe in the case of the Treatise on the Middle Way, a Mahasangika audience that he was hoping that would keep that text. So, in this way, he was the key figure, maybe we could say genuinely the protector, at a time when Mahayana was very weak and very scattered, and in this way he enabled the teachings to survive and to gradually, slowly, over a period of centuries, gain more widespread appeal, such that they could eventually be available to us today to practice and to study. So that's a different story. In this story, Nagarjuna is not a tantric master. He's not an alchemist. He doesn't go to Nalanda because it doesn't exist during his lifetime. But he does have a connection with Amitabha. He does write the Treatise on the Middle Way. He does have a connection with the Satavahana king, for whom he does write the Precious Garland. And he is, in some sense, the protector of Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, so what about these stories? I mean, obviously, the first one has the tradition behind it, and then implicitly in that various claims of the authority of sutra or of yogic knowledge. And the second one doesn't really even make any claim to certainty at all. It's really a sort of saying, it's really hard to say anything about this kind of history in India, but if we look at all the evidence and we try to sort it out, what might be the best kind of guess? Now, the other people could make other guesses, and people could do further research and get more information, but it's different in terms of the claim of what do you say, assurance that it makes. It's more like, well, here's a possibility that something that could have really happened historically. We're not saying it definitely did, right? But maybe it really could have. So it does in a way still credit Nagarjuna with knowing and saving the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, but not by going to the Naga land. And not by living 600 years. Yeah. So, I don't know what else to say about that. I just found it was interesting to try to dig out and explore and think through those two different stories. And that's not all the stories there are, obviously. One of the ways that the historical story is derived is to look at all of the other traditional stories and to think about what elements are in common between them and what elements seem to be potentially uniquely motivated. So for example, the argument is made that probably Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem because he's from Nazareth. That's not close to Bethlehem. And there was a good reason to make up a story about him being in Bethlehem when he probably wasn't, so that he can be in fulfillment of the prophecy that the Messiah would come from the house of David. Okay, so then that kind of gives a lot of, people are looking at it from the outside saying, that creates a lot of suspicion. It doesn't prove Jesus wasn't, you can't prove Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem, but it creates a lot of doubt. And it's like if you take that same kind of dispassionate attitude and apply it to these Buddhists, you can find Buddhist stories about Nagarjuna being born in every single part of India. There just really isn't any part of India where he wasn't born. And of course, all of these, claim great authority from the Shastra or the Sutra that is reporting it. So, was he really born? He was born in all of those places. Yes. No. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It becomes a little difficult. If he was a Buddha, maybe he emanated, and right. So you can, though, another way to approach it is you can say, well, let's look at the reasons people had for saying he was born in this place and that place. Doesn't seem very likely that he could have really been at Nalanda. So why did people say that he was at Nalanda? Well, because two Guhya Samaja Tantra commentaries are attributed to them, and there's a strong motivation to perceive him as being in the lineage of Guhya Samaja masters. Now, this is a very troubling thing. I'm just telling you this. I mean, you don't have to believe it, but I mean, it's like, for example, I mean, if you're initiated into Guhya Samaja Tantra and you have this lineage of masters and somebody's saying, yeah, it's just a story about Nagarjuna being one of the people in the lineage. He's not really in the lineage. It's just like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, being a big star. I mean, people have all these stories they believe. I mean, maybe some people are okay with that and some people aren't. it's clear that, it's like, as Venerable Children and I was talking about, that His Holiness is like a very, very much a modernist. And he teaches us to rely upon reason, and he appeals to us as a teacher in many ways because he sees that is what appeals to us, is to rely on reason. And he appeals to us using reason. And when you see teachings about the distance to the moon that are not concordant with modern astronomical measurement, then he says, well, we should change what what Buddhists believe to accord with what science says. But then he has maybe not fully been comfortable so far with this idea of history as a kind of science, when the results of these investigations seem to raise questions about lineages that he has experience of. Do you know what I'm saying? So he feels that he knows that Nagarjuna is part of this lineage, and if someone else seems unlikely that could possibly have happened, that doesn't outweigh his vivid experience that this is something that's the case. My own view on that is that, there's different kinds, that his vivid experience is meaningful and not discredited by the fact that didn't have to actually historically happen that way. But that may be not something that everybody is comfortable with. But anyway, that would be the way I would look at it. Let's see how much time we have. When am I supposed to stop? 11:45?
Yeah.
All right. Let me see. Next. I'll just say a little. I have just a little bit more, and then when we come back in the afternoon, let's start looking at the middle way from that, starting at page 61. Okay. So, what was the situation with? We're thinking just a little bit about this second story and how it relates to, what Nagarjuna may have been trying to do in some of his works. It's very difficult. I mean, I tried to give you the general ideas. That this idea is that he's trying to, in a sense, clear a way for it's not just simply, it looks on the surface just like destroy, analytically break up every possible thing. But it turns out it's more complicated than that as you look at other texts, right? It's not just that everything is being deconstructed. Some things are picked out to be, in the list of things that are deconstructed. So as I was suggesting, that this is not just a matter of who he was attacking, but we have to think about who he had to appeal to in order to make sure that, a way was cleared for the Mahayana, and people who had control of resources in that area, or the right to sort of make, in the case of a king, the kings had the right to intervene in monastic disputes. I may not have mentioned that, but if the Sangha have rules for settling disputes among themselves, but if they didn't, civil law in India allowed kings to intervene and to decide who was right and wrong and kick people out of monasteries. Yeah, they didn't have separation of church and state. Is my point. It's that was considered in the interest of the state to have peaceful, harmonious religious institutions. And so the kings would get involved, and did in some famous cases, like Ashoka, for example, right? Yeah. So, I guess when I was here before, Venerable Children and I talked a little bit about this idea that you find even in some of the Pali texts, Pali suttas, very early, Buddhist material that was accepted as the word of the Buddha, that the Mahayana sutras had to compete with in order to get accepted in these monasteries, that you find in those texts some things that sort of sound like Madhyamaka to a Madhyamaka reader now. And that was something that a scholar named Luis Gomez wrote about. He called it proto-Madhyamaka, that it's something that's noticeable, that if you don't just look at these sutras with the idea, oh, these people had the wrong idea because they were hinting on us, then you instead look at it with an open mind. You can say, well, gosh, if I take it out of a kind of sectarian framework, that actually sounds like it's sort of saying something that Nagarjuna would like, you know. And so that's something that a lot of people have noticed. And I mean, there's different ways to understand that. One of the things is it seems that in the early materials there's a lot of talk about dependent arising, and that there's a lot of analysis, which explaining dependent arising, discussing dependent arising, and explaining that the lack of self. But then none of this is linked in the Pali materials to emptiness per se. Emptiness is mentioned in these early materials, but it's not mentioned in relationship to no self or dependent arising. And instead, when emptiness comes up in the early materials, it's taught as sort of a peaceful mental state or a mental absorption. In one case, Buddha asked Shariputra, your complexion looks really great. What have you been meditating on these days? In more, slightly more formal language as befits the Pali Canon, I guess. And Shariputra said, I've been meditating on emptiness. And Buddha said, well, no wonder, that's the great meditation for the high and enlightened people. But he's not talking about, there's nothing related to no self. It's like a certain kind of meditative absorption that they're talking about. Maybe it's, like or not exactly the same as meditating on nothingness, the sort of like a high concentration, some sort of high samadhi state where you're detached from ordinary dualistic concepts, but there's nothing related to it being something that you've gone into on the basis of first analyzing no self. It's just you've gone into this state of a blissful state of absorption. So you've got all those things to work with. You see, you have an idea of nirvana as unconditioned peace. You have idea of emptiness as being a very peaceful kind of mental state. You have the idea of no self being that when you search among the parts of the person that you don't find the person as you thought was there. And you have the idea of dependent arising. So all of those materials are there, but they're not put together in the same way that you see them put together in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And there's nothing that says emptiness is like the way all things exist. There isn't anything like that. And then that's, of course, then what the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras are constantly saying all the way through, right? So then if you think about it, it's like, well, how would that sound to people who are used to the other one? It would sound nihilistic. And so, Nagarjuna has like this idea, this role of trying to show the connection between emptiness as which people, are predisposed to thinking of as this peaceful, quiescent stillness, but showing that this is the basic character of all phenomena from the very beginning. And it's not nihilistic because it's really the same as dependent arising, which you already believe in and have been studying as good Buddhists all this time. You see what I'm saying? So it's like we look at it now for us as like in a certain way, but it's like at the time it had a specific kind of meaning. Because they knew these words, but they didn't use the word emptiness at all in the way that, like what we're thinking of it. That idea of like emptiness as being the status of all, the mode of existence of all phenomena is like that's, a troubling or disturbing idea when you're not used to it. And so that has to be, I guess, made acceptable such that these texts can be put into accepted as Buddha Vachana and reproduced, and connecting it to ideas that are already accepted. That's what I have to say for this morning. Yes?
Yeah. Just to add that in the Pali Sutras, the word self, no self, empty was used a lot, but emptiness
right.
and selflessness or no
no selflessness. It's just, yeah, no self. No.
Or selflessness.
Say anatta, you don't say anatta, anattata. You don't have anattata, just anatta.
Yeah, sometimes they would use it, but mostly it's an adjective, and the same with emptiness.
Yeah.
They shouldn't that much in the past.
Yeah. But, right, exactly. But then, in addition to that, like, and I've looked, like, for example, if you look in these big compendiums, polytexts and so forth, you look up emptiness or empty, and it's, Buddha talks about it a few times in these polytexts, but it's about a mental state. It's about a rarefied, special, peaceful kind of mind. It's not about like it's not linked to no self in the way we would think it would be obvious. Yeah. Yeah.
But they do have this thing about nirvana has three characteristics, and one is empty, one is wishless, and one is
signless.
Yeah, signless. So they do have that. They explain it slightly.
What it means for nirvana to be empty,
Yeah.
is that it's like unconditioned, by beyond any kind of marks or signs or something like that.
In the Pali, so do they call it the three doors of liberation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they talk about the three doors of liberation, except they use it as adjectives, not as nouns.
So that was my question.
But
In the official text of the book, he first talks about the three doors and he uses the word peaceful. And then he explains it a whole other way in the way that we've heard it. And I was wondering if this is that same idea.
Well, auspicious for nirvana is peace.
yeah,
So in both traditions.
nirvana-esque or not nirvanic. Yeah, I think that's right, and that empty in that way is linked to nirvana, but then there definitely is this idea then that there's nirvana and there's non-nirvana, and that they're not, the samsaric condition then is not being posited as empty, which is of course very, so what I'm saying is that in a sense, here's the question of whether nirvana is a mental state or not, but in a certain way, that's this idea is that there's this sort of empty is like, I wonder, exactly what it's almost like suggesting devoid of dualistic conceptions, sort of transcending any kind of grasping after, and it's about the mind, not about the table or the, yeah.
I have
Yes.
a question about the traditional story and what seems like an anachronism to me of the Guru Samaja Tantra preceding the perfection away from Buddha. In that whole story, right? I mean, if he revived them, and isn't Tantra based on that understanding of...
Well, they had, I don't know why. I mean, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, according to traditional, you're talking the traditional story, it was taught, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were taught by the Buddha on Vulture Peak during his lifetime.
Yeah.
So why did they...
that they were surviving somewhere, but Nagarjuna brought them back from the Nagas for mass distribution? Or... is that must be something?
Yeah, they've been taken
Right.
to the land of the Nagas, and human beings couldn't understand it.
Yeah.
But
I mean, there were
perhaps
Mahayana...
Then if he went to the monastery early...
Oh, and he hadn't gotten the sutra yet.
Yeah, hadn't gotten the sutras
I
yet.
have no idea.
That part is like, does that ever come up, that
I
question?
haven't asked that. I don't know. But you're going to have to get somebody who's on the inside of that story.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a good point. I didn't think of that. Yeah. So, you think it's like, of course the sutras existed, but according to the story, Nagarjuna hadn't read them yet, and yet he's already being initiated into Guru Samantra. I know. Good point. Yeah. I don't know what to do with that one.
Everybody thought the passive stages
Yeah.
hadn't been, he hadn't contacted that either, well, maybe a little bit.
Well, see, one of the things is that, I mean, you understand this, is like, there's all these stories about Nagarjuna, and like there's actually kind of an argument about whether he's a first ground bodhisattva or a seventh ground bodhisattva. And people care about this. And then, but the reason I mention that is because then it's all canceled out.
Right.
Because that's just the sutra argument, the sutra level argument, you know. And sort of like they say, like Avalokitavrata, you know, they're sort of looking down on Avalokitavrata, you know. He would go along with how things appeared in the world. He appeared in the world to be a first ground bodhisattva, but inwardly he was actually a seventh ground bodhisattva going on 8 who was appearing as a first ground bodhisattva in order to benefit beings. But that's all a sutra line. That's my point. The real tantric story is completely different, you know. So that's what makes me think about. It's like, all right, well, if he is really a Buddha because of the tantric story, then the whole rest of the story is like from a sutra point of view. I think if we retold the whole story from the inside tantric point of view, it might sound different. I don't know it though. I just know that much. I think that's probably the best answer, because you have to get like the whole tantric story, if there is one. I bet there is. Okay. Well, let's stop for now, huh? And I'll be back at 3:45, I think, right?